Yesterday we just basically introduced plants. We talked about the difference between vascular and non-vascular plants. And then we just mentioned what that means, vascular. And again, vascular means the plant contains tubes, vessels, which transports things around the plant. And what needs to be transported? Water, which is absorbed in the roots, needs to be transported to all the other parts of the plant. Okay? That happens through a tube called the xylem. Also, sugars need to be moved around. Sugars that are produced in the leaves need to be relocated to other parts of the plants, which are going to need those sugars for energy. And that happens through the phloem. So the xylem is carrying water from the roots to the other parts of the plants, and then the phloem is bringing sugars that are made in the leaves to other places. And so you could see, if you think about like a piece of celery, okay? If you ever cut a piece of celery in half and you look inside of it, you'll see that there are little round, not the strings around the outside, but inside of the celery there are little round things. Those are the xylem. And if you like cut a piece of celery in half and put each side in a jar with different food coloring, what you'll see is as that water moves up through the xylem, you can see the color show through in the top of that celery. So it's just like an experiment. So when we think about a plant, when we think about its different parts, vascular plants have the root system and the shoot system. The parts that are generally above ground, okay? Leaves, the stem, flowers are the shoots of the plant. And then the underground portions are the roots. They anchor the plant in place, so it's stable. And really, we don't really imagine it, but the below ground portions of a plant are just about the same size as the above ground portions. So you look at like a tree out in that courtyard, about the same amount of materials underground that you're seeing above ground. You know, you probably noticed if you've ever been hiking, sometimes you see trees that were blown over by the wind.
And the roots are up.
And their roots are exposed and they're very large. But what you also probably notice about those roots is they're not very deep. When those trees get blown over, one of the reasons often they're growing in shallow soil, so their roots cannot go very deep and they sort of spread out lengthwise, but that doesn't give them the same anchoring that a very deep root system would do, and so they can blow over easier than plants with very deep roots. So if you go hiking like in the Adirondacks and stuff, where the bedrock is very close to the surface, the roots can't go down that deep. And so that's where you see a lot of those trees sort of blown over and their roots exposed. Leaves of a plant, they are the structures for photosynthesis. The majority of photosynthesis takes place in the leaves. You know, some plants have some chloroplasts in the stem, green plants, but leaves are the primary structure in a plant where photosynthesis happens. It's also where gases are exchanged. We know, because you guys studied photosynthesis earlier in the year, what gas is required in photosynthesis? Jackson? Carbon dioxide. Plants need to absorb carbon dioxide to turn into sugar. And though carbon dioxide gas is absorbed in the leaves. When you look at leaves like this, you see all the individual cells, okay? But you also see these things. Let me put this up for a second. I'm just outline it. Okay? You see these other things. They look like lips, kind of. Okay? Okay? You see, here's one. And it looks like lips, and then in the middle there's an opening. Okay, here's another. These are called stomates and guard cells. The middle is an opening. It's an area where carbon dioxide could come into the leaf. Okay? And there's a bunch of them. Now, when those are open, the problem is carbon dioxide can get in, but water also can evaporate through that. So on a really hot, dry day, if a plant is starting to dry out, sometimes these stomates close up and don't allow any carbon dioxide in, but also they don't allow any water to leave, so it helps the plant sort of conserve energy. Those openings are called stomates. On each side, those things that kind of open and close that hole, they're called guard cells. And they help to regulate this process we call transpiration, the movement of water into the roots of a plant, up to the leaves, and out through those openings, those stomates. We are going to spend much of this unit talking about the next structure in the shoot system, flowers. Okay. So some plants do not produce flowers. Okay. Two groups of vascular plants, angiosperms and gymnosperms. We're talking about angiosperms. Okay. These are flowering plants. Okay. And so, like we said, flowers are the male and female reproductive organs of plants. Just like in animals, there are male reproductive organs and structures that produce sperm cells. There are female reproductive organs that produce egg cells. And the combining of sperm cell and egg cell during fertilization produces new offspring in sexual reproduction. Well, plants have the same means of reproduction. They have male reproductive organs which produce reproductive cells. They have female reproductive organs that produce female reproductive cells. When male reproductive cells combine with female reproductive cells, fertilization happens and an offspring develops. So it's all the same steps. We just have different terms for them. Okay. So flowers are really reproductive organs. If you buy your mom a bouquet of flowers for Mother's Day this spring, you're really presenting her with some reproductive organs of plants. Okay. And so if you do that now, this spring, you'll be able to point out to your mother what all those parts are, which are the male parts, which are the female parts, and how flowers reproduce. So you have lots of new educational material to share with your mother on Mother's Day.
Why would she want to know that?
I don't think she likes flowers.
I'm not a good
I
boy.
feel like a place that they throw reproductive
Yes, you're throwing reproductive organs at the actors on the stage. So, yes.
I'm never touching a flower again.
So, the flowers eventually. So, if anyone, how many people have had a garden in your backyard? A garden. Okay. All right. How many of you have grown tomatoes in your backyard? That's like my favorite thing to grow. Okay. So if you've ever helped out in the garden, as summer's going along, your tomatoes, the actual tomato, what does it start as? The actual thing you're going to eat. Well, it's a seed. It grows into a plant.
Food.
Do the leaves turn into tomatoes?
No, the flower. It makes
No.
a flower.
It starts with a yellow flower.
Is that how pumpkins grow?
Almost most
And
all
apples.
fruits. So
Strawberries?
the flower develops, and tomatoes, for example, it's a yellow flower.
It gets pollinated.
It gets pollinated, and then the flower starts to change. It develops into a fruit, and that's what a tomato is. Okay. So flowers eventually turn into fruits, which contain seeds. And what is a seed? So what would we call it? What would you call an animal something that grows into another animal?
Baby.
An embryo? Okay. A seed is a plant embryo. It's produced after fertilization. It will grow into a new plant. Okay. So you're eating those sunflower seeds. Okay.
We're eating
You're
children.
chewing on little embryos, little plant embryos.
I watched it all.
I've eaten a lot
All right.
of
So
children.
let's talk about these parts of the flower, because you're gonna have to know all these parts and what all of them do. You guys study this ever?
No.
All right. So at the base of a flower,
Nice job.
are
Indulgent.
these green structures. Okay? These green structures are called the sepals. And they basically provide sort of a platform for the rest of the flower to be supported on. They protect the flower, okay, as it develops. Flowers go through sort of a development period. They start off small, they bloom, they open up. Okay? And so the sepals are sort of the base of that flower. And then we have obviously the petals of a flower. Okay? Now often, not always, the petals of a flower are brightly colored, and that's to attract animals. Sometimes petals might not be colored, and there's a reason for that. And so within a flower, different parts, there are reproductive cells. We call reproductive cells gametes. And they're special cells, and we'll talk about this later in the year, with half the number of chromosomes as typical cells. And these reproductive cells, their function is to produce offspring. So in animals, we would call the male gamete a sperm cell. We don't call it a sperm cell in plants. Okay? It's a pollen grain. Within a pollen grain is an actual sperm cell, but we're going to call it pollen. Pollen is that stuff, you know, in the spring, blows around sometimes like your whole driveway's covered in greenish, yellow dust. That's pollen. Those are reproductive cells. That's plant sperm. Within the flower is a part that contains the female gametes, okay, which are ovules. They have egg cells in them. When a pollen grain, the sperm cell within it, combines with an ovule and the egg cell in it, what would we call that? Well, it forms a seed. We would say that it has been pollinated, that it's been fertilized. Pollination leads to fertilization. Just like sperm cell meeting egg cell is fertilization. It produces an embryo. So plants can reproduce sexually or asexually. Depends on the types of plants. Okay? But in sexual reproduction in plants, as we've talked about, requires two different parent plants. The offspring are unique. They're not identical to either plant. They have a combination of traits, of characteristics of each plant. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves just a single individual basically making a copy of itself. And we'll talk later on, but these are some plants that reproduce asexually. They're growing out some roots, popping up new plants along the way, but they're just copies of this original plant. When we have pollen grains landing on the female parts of a flower and pollinating, that's a form of sexual reproduction. Okay?
If you have like two like different plants that like reproduce sexually, did you have like a hybrid plant?
Oh, it's in a way similar to animals, only if they're very closely related. So pollen from one species pollinates its own species generally. Okay, and doesn't pollinate any other species. All right, so let's talk about these actual parts. All right, so we have male reproductive organs and female reproductive organs in flowers. Okay. The male reproductive parts are these parts. Okay. So I hold in my hand the male reproductive organs of a flower. Okay. The male reproductive organs, this whole entire thing is called the stamen. Okay. And so you've probably, if you ever looked at a flower closely, you've seen these things sticking up. You've seen have this little bulb at the end. Sometimes it's like powdery. Okay, might have sort of dust on it. These are the male reproductive parts. The whole thing's called a stamen. It's made of two parts. Okay, this top part is the anther. Okay, this long part that holds it in the air is called the filaments. The anther, its job is to produce the pollen, the male sex cells, the gametes. This is where pollen comes from this anther on the stamen. The filament basically just holds the anther in place, supporting it. Because the placement of the anther is often important. Now I hold in my hand the female reproductive organs of this flower. Okay, so this is generally in the center of the flower. The entire thing is called the pistil. Okay,
Why is there so many male reproductive?
we'll talk about that. Good question. And there's a reason for that. So the pistil is the female parts of the plant. It's composed of the stigma on top, then the style, and then at the bottom is the ovary. Those are the three parts of the female reproductive parts of the pistil. Okay? The stigma at the top, this is where pollen grains need to land in order for pollination to occur. So pollen lands on that stigma. The style is this elongated part that keeps the stigma up in the air. And then in the base, this enlarged part, this is the ovary. Okay. And just like in animals, the ovary contains eggs, contains ovules. The female sex cells are in the ovary.
Wait, so a plant is both a female and male?
That's another good question. So it depends. So there are some plants, and we'll talk about this, that are called complete plants. They have both male and female reproductive organs in a single flower. Other plants, some flowers have only male parts. Other flowers on the same plant have only female parts. Other plants, a whole plant is only male parts, and a whole different plant is only female parts. So there's a variation there. Okay? So again, this is a lily. Flower you've probably seen growing on the side of the road, maybe growing in your house, in your landscape. Okay? And again, you have the sepals protecting it, the petals to attract pollinators, several stamen with anthers supported on filaments, and then a central pistil made of the ovary, style, and stigma. Okay? So they're reproductive structures, flowers. Okay? Outer ring of leaves, which you see here. This is a flower. Before, flowers, like I said, mature over time. They start generally closed up and sealed almost. And then as the flower develops, they open up. Here you could see in this rose, I believe.
Are they called buds?
Well, flower buds are what sort of the beginning stages of a flower. So this is a rose, and it's still closed. It hasn't opened up yet in its development. It's protected by these sepals. The petals then open up. Okay, they're basically leaves, modified leaves, but often they are brightly colored if they're meant to attract pollinators. And once the flower completely opens up in its maturity, it exposes the male and female structures inside so that pollen from the male parts can fertilize the ovules in the female parts of the flower.
Why do the flowers like smell nice?
Why do you think?
Pollen.
Oh, because to attract, yeah.
To attract what?
Bees.
Pollen.
Bees often
Pollinators.
insects, pollinators. So flowers that have a strong scent often are insect pollinated flowers. Again, I'll show you some pictures. These are actual flowers again, and you see the stamen, you see the anthers, you can see this sort of powdery film on it. That's the pollen. These anthers have developed and matured enough that they're releasing their pollen, and then in the middle you have the stigma of the pistil. Okay? Another plant. Looks like some sort of lily. Again, you see these are the anthers of the stamen. Often they stay protected with like a covering until they're ready to release the pollen. And you can see this one starting to open up to release pollen. And again, we have the style and the stigma on top. So pollination is the process of pollen from male parts landing on the stigma of a plant is pollination. Now in some plants and sometimes pollen from one flower can land on the stigma of the same flower and pollinate it. This is called self-pollination. Okay? So if pollen from this anther lands on this stigma and grows, that's self-pollination. But does that provide the benefits of sexual reproduction? No, because it's not two parents mixing their genetic material, it's just one original parent. What typically happens is what we call cross-pollination, in which pollen from one plant fertilizes a different plant. That's cross-pollination. And that does provide the variation that comes from sexual reproduction. So once pollen lands on that stigma, it grows a tube until it reaches the ovule, and then fertilization takes place.
Can you go back to that?
Yeah. All right, so I didn't get to what I needed to get to for both sheets of homework. I have one page that is homework for tonight.